Lawyers, what is the most outrageous case you've taken on? Story 1. A client once walked into my office claiming their neighbor stole their backyard. Literally. They said the fence had been mysteriously moved 5 feet overnight, and now the neighbor's dog was sunbathing where their patio used to be. I thought it sounded ridiculous until I visited the property myself. Sure enough, the fence looked freshly installed, and the neighbor's smug grin when I asked about it told me everything I needed to know. We took the case to court, armed with property maps, surveys, and even satellite images showing the fence's original position. The neighbor's defense? They claimed the fence had always been there and that my client was just trying to start drama. Classic gaslighting. Things got even weirder when the neighbor's contractor admitted, under oath, that they had been hired for a late-night project. The judge was not amused. In the end, my client won, the fence was moved back, and the neighbor had to pay damages. But the best part? My client threw a barbecue the next weekend and invited everyone on the street, except the neighbor. Petty? Maybe. Satisfying? Definitely. Story 2. My old boss called me at 10 p.m. on a Friday night to ask why I hadn't responded to an email he sent at 9:45. I told him I wasn't working at 10 p.m. on a Friday. He said, "Work-life balance is for people who don't want promotions." I thought he was joking, but nope, dead serious. Fast forward a few weeks, and I found out he'd started copying the entire leadership team on emails about my lack of dedication. I wasn't about to let that slide, so I compiled a folder of every inappropriate comment he'd made, every unreasonable deadline he'd set, and every late-night rant he'd sent to my inbox. When HR called me in, I thought I was about to get fired. Turns out, they'd already reviewed my folder and decided my boss was the problem. He got reassigned to some project in the middle of nowhere. As for me, I got a raise and a new manager who respected work-life balance. He messed around and found out. Story 3. I once agreed to house sit for my friend while they went on vacation. Simple enough, right? Feed the cat, water the plants, and collect the mail. On day 2, I noticed the cat staring intently at the corner of the living room. I figured it was just doing cat things until I heard scratching inside the wall. Long story short, there was a raccoon living in their walls. I called animal control, but they couldn't do anything without the homeowner's permission. My friend was unreachable because, of course, they were off the grid. So I did the next logical thing. I bribed the raccoon with peanut butter sandwiches to coax it out. It worked, but then it refused to leave the house. It just sat on the couch like it paid rent. When my friend finally came back, they thought I was joking, until they saw the raccoon and promptly named it Roger. The last I heard, Roger still lives there. They claim he's part of the family now. Honestly, I don't ask questions anymore. Edit. I just got a text. Roger apparently has his own Instagram now. I don't even know what to say. Story 4. My roommate once accused me of stealing her avocado. Not avocados, plural. Just one avocado. She stormed into my room, waving the pit like it was a smoking gun. I hadn't touched her avocado, but she wouldn't let it go. She even suggested we install cameras in the kitchen to catch me in the act. Over an avocado. I finally got fed up and bought a dozen avocados just to shut her up. But then, things got even weirder. I found out she'd been eating my snacks for weeks and blaming it on ghosts. I confronted her, and her excuse? She said she thought I wouldn't mind. The final straw came when I caught her sneaking one of my frozen pizzas into her room. I kicked her out that weekend. I lost an avocado but gained a hilarious story and a much better roommate. Story 5. I used to work in retail, and one day a customer came in and tried to return a TV. The problem? It wasn't from our store. It wasn't even the same brand we carried. When I politely explained this, they flipped out, claiming they'd definitely bought it here and demanding to speak to a manager. Classic. My manager came out, took one look at the TV, and said, "Sir, this has a sticker from another store on it." The customer's response? "You're just saying that because you don't want to help me." After 15 minutes of arguing, they stormed out, yelling about how no one wants to work anymore. A week later, The same customer came back with a TV box, still not from our store, and tried again. This time, I just pointed to the door. Some people think persistence can overpower reality. It can't. Story 6. I once worked at a small tech startup, and everything was fine until the CEO decided to hire his cousin to help out in marketing. The problem? His cousin had zero experience and thought SEO stood for some easy opportunity. It became a disaster almost immediately. One day, the cousin decided to run an ad campaign for a product we didn't even sell. When I pointed it out, she shrugged and said, "Well, we could sell it." The CEO backed her up, claiming it was innovative thinking. We ended up with hundreds of customer inquiries about a product we had no way to produce. Things reached peak chaos when she posted a photo of the office dog on our company's LinkedIn with the caption, "Meet our new VP of Marketing." That might have been funny if the dog wasn't sitting next to a very confidential prototype in the photo. She lasted 3 months before the board stepped in and told the CEO it was her or them. Nepotism doesn't innovate, it just frustrates. Story 7. I once helped a friend plan their wedding, and let me tell you, nothing prepares you for the sheer chaos of family drama. A week before the big day, the bride's sister announced that she too was getting married. On the same day. She even booked a separate venue. You'd think the bride would be furious, but no. She decided to outclass her sister by renting a horse-drawn carriage at the last minute. The carriage company cancelled because the venue wasn't horse-friendly, so she settled for a llama. Yes, a llama in a bridal veil. On the wedding day, the sister's ceremony was running late, so some of her guests accidentally showed up at the wrong venue. The bride decided to let them stay, claiming it was karma. The llama ended up photobombing every picture, and honestly, it looked better dressed than most of the guests. If you think your family has issues, just remember the llama. 8. A neighbor once borrowed my ladder and forgot to return it for 3 months. Every time I asked for it back, he claimed he wasn't done using it. What could anyone possibly be doing with a ladder for 3 months? Building a mansion? One day, I walked past his yard and saw my ladder leaning against a tree, covered in Christmas lights. Mind you, this was in March. When I knocked on his door, he said, "Oh, I was going to give it back, but I figured you didn't need it." I told him I needed it right now and watched as he spent 20 minutes untangling the lights while muttering about ungrateful neighbors. I finally got my ladder back, and guess what? It was bent in the middle. If you lend something out, don't expect it back in one piece, if at all. Story 9. I worked at a call center where we tracked everything. Calls, emails, even bathroom breaks. One day, management sent out an email saying we were no longer allowed to use the bathroom during the first or last 30 minutes of our shifts because it was prime productivity time. People were furious. A week later, one of my co-workers decided to test the policy by not going to the bathroom all day. Around 3 p.m., they dramatically stood up, shouted, "I can't hold it anymore!" and ran out of the office. Management tried to discipline them, but word got out, and half the team started doing the same thing. Eventually, HR stepped in and revoked the policy. The best part? The co-worker who started the whole thing got promoted to team lead a month later. Don't never underestimate the power of collective bladder rebellion. Story 10. I once had a client who wanted me to negotiate a prenup for her. Nothing unusual, except she wanted to include a clause that her fiancé could only play video games for 2 hours a week. When I gently suggested this might not go over well, she said, "If he loves me, he'll agree." Well, the fiancé showed up for the signing, saw the clause, and refused to even sit down. They got into a shouting match in my office while I just sat there pretending to review paperwork. Finally, the fiancé stood up and said, "If you want to marry a robot, go buy one," and walked out. A week later, she called me and said they'd broken up. She asked if I could help her write a post-nuptial agreement for her next relationship. Love may be blind, but contracts aren't. Story 11. I used to work at a restaurant where one of the regulars had a very specific request. Their steak had to be cooked exactly 45 seconds on each side. No more, no less. One day, we had a new cook who didn't know about this and left the steak on for a full minute per side. The customer cut into it, gasped like they'd been personally betrayed, and demanded to see the manager. The manager, already exhausted from a long shift, calmly explained that the steak was still rare. The customer pulled out a thermometer, stuck it in the steak, and said, "This is 2 degrees over." I thought they were joking, but nope, dead serious. Eventually, the manager comped their meal just to get them to leave. The kicker? They came back the next week and ordered the exact same thing, as if nothing had happened. People take steak way too seriously. Story 12. A coworker once borrowed my car to run a quick errand during lunch. I didn't think much of it until 2 hours passed and they still weren't back. When I finally called them, they casually said, "Oh, I decided to drive home to grab something I forgot." Their home was 2 hours away. By the time they returned, the gas tank was almost empty, and my boss was furious at me for missing an important meeting. The coworker's excuse? "I didn't think you'd mind. It's not like you needed the car during work hours." I told them they could forget about ever borrowing anything from me again. Don't lend your car to someone unless you're okay with it becoming their personal Uber. 13. One time, my neighbor asked me to watch their dog while they were out of town for a weekend. Easy enough, right? Except they failed to mention that their dog was actually 3 giant Great Danes who thought they were lapdogs. By the end of the first day, they'd knocked over a lamp, chewed through my couch cushions, and figured out how to open the fridge. The final straw came when one of them dragged my mattress halfway across the room while I was trying to sleep. When the neighbors got back, they laughed and said, "Yeah, they can be a handful." They didn't even offer to pay for the damage. If someone says their dog is low maintenance, don't believe them. Story 14. I once had a professor who was obsessed with his own book. He made it mandatory for the class, even though it was overpriced and had nothing to do with the subject we were studying. During lectures, he'd randomly stop and say, "That reminds me of something I wrote on page 134. Everyone, take out your copies." One day, a student raised their hand and said, "I couldn't afford the book." The professor stared at them like they'd just confessed to a crime. He then gave a 15-minute rant about how his book was an essential masterpiece. The kicker? The student borrowed a copy from someone else and found out the professor had plagiarized half the content from older textbooks. By the end of the semester, the school quietly removed his book from the syllabus. His masterpiece wasn't even original. Story 15. A friend of mine once called me in a panic because they'd locked themselves out of their apartment. When I got there, I asked if they had a spare key or if we should call a locksmith. They said, "No need, I have a foolproof plan." Their plan? To climb up the fire escape and break in through the bathroom window. They got halfway up before realizing the window was locked, so they decided to climb back down and kick in the door instead. I told them it was a terrible idea, but they insisted they'd seen it work in movies. Spoiler, it didn't. They ended up with a broken door, a bruised foot, and a very annoyed landlord. The funniest part? They found their keys in their backpack 5 minutes later. Sometimes the simplest solution is just looking in your bag. Chapter 16. I once went on a first date that started off perfectly normal. Coffee, light conversation, the usual. Then halfway through, they casually mentioned that they were in the process of suing their ex. Naturally, I asked why, thinking it might be something serious. Their response? They stole my idea for a podcast. They went on to explain, in excruciating detail, how their ex had launched a true crime podcast that was suspiciously similar to the one they'd been brainstorming. When I asked if they'd actually started their podcast or written anything down, they said, "No, but it was in my head and that counts." I made an excuse to leave shortly after, only to get a text the next day saying, "I think we really connected. Want to start a podcast together?" Always vet your date for litigious tendencies. 17. I had a landlord who insisted on letting himself into my apartment whenever he felt like it. He claimed it was just to check the plumbing, but I'd find him snooping through my kitchen cabinets or sitting on my couch watching TV. One time, I came home early and caught him trying to take my vacuum cleaner. He said, "Oh, I thought this was mine." After multiple complaints, he finally stopped showing up unannounced, but then he started calling me every day to check in. When I didn't answer, he left voicemails reminding me to water the plants. I didn't have any. I moved out as soon as my lease ended, but not before leaving him a detailed review online. My landlord thought he was my roommate. Story 18. I once worked at an office where the air conditioning was controlled by one guy, Steve. Steve wasn't in management or facilities. He just claimed the thermostat as his own. Every time someone adjusted it, Steve would magically appear within minutes to change it back to his preferred setting, Arctic tundra. One day, someone put a lockbox over the thermostat. Steve responded by bringing in a space heater for his desk. When people complained about the electric bill skyrocketing, Steve blamed it on the coffee machine. Eventually, HR got involved, and Steve was told to stop. His revenge? He left sticky notes all over the office saying, "Sweat it out." Office politics are wild, especially when thermostats are involved. For 19, a neighbor once offered to fix my leaky faucet. He said he was good with tools, so I figured, why not? Big mistake. Within an hour, my kitchen was flooded, and he was standing there with a wrench saying, "I didn't think that pipe was important." I ended up having to call a professional plumber, who said it would have been cheaper if I'd called them first. When I told my neighbor this, he said, "At least I didn't charge you." True, but now I had a soaked kitchen and a higher water bill. The kicker? A week later, he asked to borrow my ladder to help out another neighbor. I just laughed and said absolutely not. Free help is rarely free. Star. I once got stuck on a family road trip with my aunt, who insisted on being the DJ. Her playlist? Nothing but songs from the same boy band, on repeat, for 6 hours. Every time someone asked if we could listen to something else, she'd say, "This is their year." Halfway through, the car broke down in the middle of nowhere. While we waited for roadside assistance, she pulled out a portable speaker and kept the boy band marathon going. By the time the tow truck arrived, even she admitted she was sick of their music. The rest of the trip, we drove in silence. Sometimes the worst part of a road trip isn't the breakdown, it's the soundtrack. Story 21. I once had a coworker who was convinced they could fix the office Wi-Fi by rearranging the router and cables. They claimed to have read an article about feng shui for technology. I walked in one day to find them dangling the router from the ceiling with a piece of string. They said it would improve the signal flow. Surprisingly, it worked for about an hour, until the whole system crashed. It had to come in, and when they saw the router swinging like a disco ball, they just stared at us in disbelief. Feng Shui is not a substitute for actual technical knowledge. Story 22. My cousin decided to host Thanksgiving dinner for the first time, but they were determined to modernize it. No turkey, no mashed potatoes, not even pie. Instead, they served sushi, kale smoothies, and some kind of tofu, turkey alternative. The family was polite for about 10 minutes until my grandma loudly asked, "Where's the real food?" My cousin tried to explain their vision, but by then, my uncle was already ordering pizza. By the end of the night, everyone was sitting around a stack of takeout boxes while my cousin sulked in the corner. Never mess with Thanksgiving traditions unless you're ready for a family mutiny. Story 23. I once dated someone who insisted on being spontaneous. At first it was cute, random road trips, surprise picnics, that sort of thing. Then one day, they showed up at my job unannounced and said, "Pack your things, we're going skydiving." I thought they were kidding. They weren't. I tried to explain that I couldn't just leave work, but they kept insisting, "Live a little." My boss overheard and asked if everything was okay. I had to awkwardly explain that my partner thought skydiving was more important than my job. They left in a huff, and later that night they texted, "If you can't be spontaneous, this won't work." There's a fine line between adventurous and unreasonable. Charlie 24. My upstairs neighbor once decided to install a home gym. Sounds fine, right? Except they didn't use actual gym equipment. They filled buckets with concrete and started lifting those instead. Every time they dropped one, it sounded like the ceiling was about to cave in. When I finally went upstairs to ask them to keep it down, they proudly showed me their DIY gym setup. It looked like something out of a survivalist bunker. I suggested they try a real gym, and they said, "Why pay for one when I can just annoy you for free?" Eventually, the landlord got involved and made them stop. Home workouts are great, but maybe not at the expense of your neighbor's sanity. Story 25. I once volunteered to babysit my friend's toddler for an afternoon. Easy gig, right? Wrong. Within an hour, the kid had managed to lock themselves in the bathroom with an entire roll of duct tape. How? I have no idea. I tried talking them into unlocking the door, but they just giggled and said, "I'm making art." By the time I got the door open, the walls, the sink, and even the toilet were covered in duct tape. They looked so proud of themselves that I couldn't even be mad. When my friend got home, I expected them to freak out, but they just shrugged and said, "Oh, they do that sometimes." Babysitting, not as simple as it seems. Story 26. My college roommate once decided to start a side hustle selling custom t-shirts. At first, I thought it was a great idea, until they started using our dorm room as their production studio. They bought a heat press and stacks of blank shirts, and suddenly, half the room looked like a sweatshop. The kicker? They had no idea what they were doing. One night, the heat press overheated, and the fire alarm went off. Everyone in the building had to evacuate at 2 a.m. When campus security asked what happened, my roommate said, "I was just making art." Needless to say, they got shut down pretty quickly. Some businesses are better left outside of a shared living space. Story 27. I once went to a family reunion where two cousins got into an argument over who made the best potato salad. It started as a friendly debate, but quickly escalated into a full-on food fight. By the end of it, there was mashed potato on the ceiling, and someone's dog was eating pie off the floor. The funniest part? The aunts and uncles were just sitting there, calmly eating their meals like nothing was happening. One of them even said, "Well, at least it's not as bad as last year." Family reunions, where chaos is always on the menu. Story 28. I used to work at a coffee shop where one regular customer would order the most ridiculous drinks. Think quad shot, half decaf, no foam, extra hot, oat milk latte with a drizzle of honey and a sprinkle of cinnamon. One day, we accidentally gave them a regular latte instead. They took one sip, gasped, and shouted, "This is poison!" When we explained the mistake, they demanded a refund, a free drink, and a written apology. The manager, trying to defuse the situation, offered them a gift card. Their response? "This doesn't fix the trauma I've experienced." They never came back, but we all secretly hoped they'd walk into a Starbucks and try the same stunt. Some people treat coffee orders like life or death situations. Story 29. A neighbor once offered to babysit my dog while I was out of town. When I got back, they proudly told me they'd taught my dog a new trick. Intrigued, I asked what it was. They grinned and said, "Watch this!" Then they held out a slice of pizza, and my dog immediately snatched it out of their hand. Apparently, they thought it was hilarious to teach my dog how to steal food. For weeks afterward, I couldn't leave anything on the counter without my dog trying to grab it. I had to retrain them from scratch. The neighbor? They thought it was just a bit of fun. Be careful who you trust with your pets. 4030. I once worked at a company where the CEO decided to hold mandatory Fun Fridays. Every Friday afternoon, we were required to participate in team-building activities like karaoke, trust falls, or charades. If you didn't join in, you had to explain why in front of everyone. One Friday, a co-worker decided they'd had enough. During karaoke, they grabbed the mic and sang a brutally honest parody of a pop song about how mandatory fun wasn't fun at all. The whole office laughed, but the CEO was not amused. The next week, the Friday activities were mysteriously cancelled. Forcing fun is a great way to make everyone hate it. Start 31. A friend of mine once invited me to their game night, but when I showed up, It was just them trying to beat me at Monopoly. I thought we'd play a few rounds and call it a night, but they were deadly serious. They brought out spreadsheets to track properties and even a timer to make sure I didn't take too long deciding. When I landed on one of their hotels and couldn't pay, they declared me bankrupt and made me leave the game early. Literally, they told me to get off the couch so they could focus better. Never underestimate someone who calls Monopoly a strategy game. Story 32. I once had a boss who believed in motivational speeches, but wasn't very good at them. One Monday morning, he gathered the team and started with, "Success is like climbing a mountain." Sounds fine, right? Then he added, "And some of you are just stuck at the bottom." The room went dead silent. Someone asked, "So, are you saying we're not successful?" He paused, then said, "Well, I didn't name names." By the end of the meeting, no one felt motivated, and the rest of the week was incredibly awkward. Sometimes it's better to skip the speeches and just buy everyone coffee. 33. A neighbor once asked me to water their plants while they were on vacation. They handed me a detailed schedule with specific times and amounts for each plant, plus instructions on how to talk to them nicely. I thought they were kidding, but nope, they were serious. I followed the schedule for a couple of days, but by midweek, I got busy and skipped a day. When they came back, they said, "I can tell you missed Tuesday. The plants seem upset." I thought they were joking until they started inspecting the leaves for stress marks. Some people take plant care to a whole new level. 34. I once went to a wedding where the bride and groom insisted on writing their own vows. The brides were sweet and heartfelt, but the groom's? He started by thanking her for not leaving him after the chili incident, then spent 5 minutes talking about her cooking. He didn't even mention love until the very end. The bride smiled through it, but during the reception, her maid of honor stood up and said, "Let's hope his next speech is about something other than dinner." The crowd laughed, but the groom didn't look thrilled. If you're writing vows, maybe don't focus on food. Entry 35. I once helped my friend move, and everything was going fine until we got to their couch. It wouldn't fit through the door, no matter how we angled it. After an hour of struggling, someone jokingly suggested we cut it in half. My friend, who was already stressed, said, "That's actually not a bad idea." Before I could stop them, they grabbed a saw and started cutting. We all stood there in stunned silence as they hacked their couch into 2 pieces. When we finally got it inside, they looked at the wreckage and said, "I'll just duct tape it back together." Sometimes stress makes people take advice they really shouldn't. Story 36. I once worked at a grocery store where a customer came in and tried to return a watermelon. The reason? It was too round. I thought they were joking, but no. They went on a 5-minute rant about how perfectly round watermelons are unnatural and how this one couldn't be trusted. When the manager came over, they asked if they'd at least eaten any of it. The customer said, "Of course not. I'm not falling for that." They left without a refund, still muttering about conspiracy theories. Some people find problems in the strangest places. Story 37. My neighbor once asked if I could help set up their new TV. When I got there, they handed me a box with "assembly required" written on it. I thought they meant a TV stand or maybe a wall mount. Nope. It was a DIY projector kit. I spent 2 hours putting it together while they kept saying, "It's supposed to be easy." By the time I finished, the picture was upside down and the sound didn't work. They thanked me by offering a cup of instant coffee and saying, "Well, at least it kind of works." Never trust someone who says it's easy when handing you a box of parts. Story 38. I once had a classmate who claimed they could memorize anything in under a minute. They'd brag about it constantly, so one day, someone handed them the first page of Moby Dick and said, "Prove it." They stared at it for a minute, handed it back, and then completely blanked when asked to recite it. Instead of admitting defeat, they said, "I'm just not in the mood today." After that, no one believed a word they said about their photographic memory. If you're going to brag, make sure you can back it up. Form 39. A friend of mine once got a great deal on a second-hand car. or so they thought. A week after buying it, they noticed the radio only played one station, no matter what button they pressed. When they went to get it fixed, the mechanic found that the entire dashboard had been duct taped together behind the scenes. They confronted the seller, who just shrugged and said, "Hey, it runs, doesn't it?" They ended up spending more on repairs than they did on the car itself. If a deal seems too good to be true, it probably is. Story 40. I once joined a local book club, thinking it would be a fun, low-key way to meet people. Instead, it turned into a battlefield. One woman insisted on only reading mystery novels, while another said she couldn't handle the suspense. Every meeting devolved into arguments about the book choice, and eventually, people stopped reading the books entirely. At one point, someone brought a book they hadn't even read, but said the cover looked nice. The group fell apart after that. Sometimes the biggest drama comes from people who claim to love books. Story 41. A coworker once decided to microwave fish for lunch in the office break room. Classic mistake, but it didn't end there. The microwave broke mid-cycle, leaving the fish half-cooked and the entire office reeking like a seafood market on a hot day. Instead of throwing it out, they tried to fix the microwave by unplugging it and plugging it back in, which somehow caused a power surge. The building lost electricity for an hour, and we all had to work by flashlight. When management asked what happened, they shrugged and said, "I just wanted lunch." Never trust someone who thinks fish is a good office meal. Story 42. I once went on a camping trip with some friends, and one of them insisted they were an expert survivalist. On the first night, they tried to start a fire by rubbing two sticks together. After 30 minutes of nothing, they gave up and used a lighter, but accidentally lit their sleeve on fire in the process. The next morning, they claimed they'd caught breakfast, but all they'd done was steal food from someone else's campsite. We ended up cutting the trip short after they got us lost on a trail they swore they knew like the back of their hand. Too long. Didn't read. Some people are better at surviving in theory than in practice. Story 43. My landlord once decided to upgrade the plumbing in my apartment. He said it would take one day and wouldn't disrupt anything. By the end of the day, the water was completely shut off. The bathroom sink was in the hallway, and the kitchen faucet only sprayed cold water, sideways. When I asked when it would be fixed, he said, "It's a process." It took 3 weeks before everything was back to normal, and even then, the shower still made a weird whistling noise every time it turned on. Too long. Didn't read. DIY upgrades aren't always an upgrade. Story 44. I once agreed to help a friend plan their wedding, thinking it would be simple. Little did I know, they'd turn into a full-on bridezilla. They demanded that the bridesmaids all dye their hair the same color to match the aesthetic, and even tried to get us to wear contact lenses to make our eyes pop. The final straw came when they asked me to learn calligraphy so I could handwrite all the invitations. 2 weeks before the wedding, I politely declined and stepped down as a bridesmaid. The wedding went on, but half the bridal party had quit by then. Sometimes saying no is the best wedding gift you can give yourself. Story 45. I once borrowed a friend's bike for a quick ride around the neighborhood. Halfway through, the chain popped off, and I ended up walking it back. When I returned it, they laughed and said, "Oh yeah, it does that sometimes." A week later, they called me, furious that the bike was damaged, and said I owed them for repairs. I reminded them about the chain issue, but they insisted it was perfectly fine before I used it. I refused to pay, and we haven't spoken since. Too long. Didn't read. Borrowing things from friends can cost more than money. 46. A colleague once decided to bring their dog to work because it was Bring Your Pet to Work Day. Except it wasn't. They just assumed it was okay. The dog, a massive Great Dane, ended up knocking over a co-worker's desk, eating someone's lunch, and nearly pulling the fire alarm when its leash got caught on the wall. The manager wasn't thrilled, but didn't want to make a scene, so they awkwardly let it slide. By the end of the day, the dog was happily napping under the break room table, while everyone tiptoed around it, pretending nothing was wrong. 47. I once went to a friend's paint and sip party, expecting a relaxing evening of art and wine. Instead, it turned into a competitive event when one guest showed up with a full set of professional brushes and their own canvas. They spent the entire night critiquing everyone else's work, saying things like, "That perspective is a bit off." By the end of the night, they'd practically taken over, giving unsolicited lessons, and even trying to repaint someone else's canvas. The host eventually asked them to leave, but not before they tried to take home the wine as payment for their expertise. Pattern 48. My neighbor decided to build a treehouse in their backyard for their kids. It seemed like a sweet idea, until I noticed they had no clue what they were doing. They started hammering random boards together with no plan, and the whole structure looked like it would collapse in a light breeze. When I asked if they needed help, they said, "No, this is all part of the process." A week later, the treehouse was abandoned, and the boards sat in their yard for months. The kids ended up playing with the cardboard boxes, the wood came in instead. Sunny 49. I once shared an apartment with a roommate who was obsessed with meal prepping. Every Sunday, they'd take over the entire kitchen for hours, chopping and cooking for the week. The problem? They never cleaned up. By Monday morning, the counters would be covered in food scraps, and every dish we owned would be piled in the sink. When I confronted them, they said, "It's part of the process, I'll get to it." They never did. I eventually started eating out just to avoid the mess. When I moved out, I left them a gift, a set of cleaning supplies. Story 50. A friend once asked me to join them for a quick run to the store. It sounded simple enough, but halfway there, they said, "Oh, I just need to make a couple more stops." 4 hours later, we'd been to 3 stores, the post office, a gas station, and a drive-thru. By the time we got home, they casually said, "Thanks for hanging out," as if they hadn't just hijacked my entire afternoon. After that, I started driving my own car whenever we went anywhere, just in case. Story 51. I once went to a friend's birthday party that was supposed to be a small gathering. When I arrived, there were over 50 people crammed into their tiny apartment, and the theme? Medieval costumes. Apparently, everyone got the memo except me. I stood there in jeans and a t-shirt, surrounded by knights, princesses, and even someone dressed as a dragon. To make matters worse, the food was all period appropriate, which meant no utensils, just bread, cheese, and turkey legs. One guy decided to stay in character all night, speaking in Old English and challenging people to duels with foam swords. By the end of the night, someone spilled wine all over the host's carpet, and the dragon costume caught on fire from a misplaced candle. The fire department had to come, and the host spent the rest of the evening explaining why their living room looked like a Renaissance fair gone wrong. Story 52. My cousin once decided to start a food blog. They invited me over to help taste test recipes, which sounded fun, until I realized they were trying to make everything from scratch, including things like soy sauce and ketchup. The kitchen was a disaster, with pots boiling over, flour covering every surface, and the smoke alarm going off every 20 minutes. The worst part? None of the food was edible. The soy sauce tasted like salt water, the ketchup was just sweet tomato paste, and their attempt at homemade pasta ended in a gloopy mess. They kept asking, "Isn't this amazing?" while I tried to smile through bites of undercooked bread. By the end of the night, they announced they were launching the blog anyway, using heavily filtered photos of the mess they'd made. I'm pretty sure they only posted once before giving up entirely. Story 53. I had a coworker who insisted they could predict the weather better than any meteorologist. They'd show up to work in shorts and flip-flops, claiming it was going to be unseasonably warm, only for it to start pouring an hour later. They'd blame the rain on shifting jet streams and insist they weren't wrong. One day, they convinced everyone to skip umbrellas because there's no chance of rain today. By lunch, the entire office was drenched from a surprise thunderstorm. Instead of admitting defeat, they said, "Well, technically, it wasn't supposed to rain here. It's probably a fluke." After that, no one trusted their weather predictions, but they kept making them anyway, proudly declaring things like, "It feels like snow's coming," in the middle of July. Story 54. A neighbor once hosted a garage sale and asked if I wanted to help. I agreed, thinking it would be a simple morning of folding clothes and selling old furniture. What I didn't realize was that they had no intention of actually selling anything. Every time someone asked about an item, they'd say, "Oh, that's not for sale," or, "Actually, I think I might keep that." One customer spent 20 minutes haggling over a lamp, only for the neighbor to say, "You know what? I've changed my mind. I really like this lamp." People started leaving in frustration, and by noon, no one was even stopping by. At the end of the day, the neighbor proudly declared, "Well, at least I didn't lose anything." Meanwhile, I'd wasted my entire Saturday watching them argue over items they clearly didn't want to part with. Story 55. A friend of mine once decided to host a mystery dinner party where everyone had to play a character. I thought it would be fun, but they forgot to assign roles ahead of time, so we had to make them up on the spot. This led to complete chaos. One person decided to be a pirate, another was an astronaut, and I ended up being a local beekeeper. The plot made no sense because the host kept changing the story halfway through. At one point, the astronaut declared the pirate was the murderer, and the beekeeper, me, was apparently smuggling honey laced with poison. By the end of the night, no one had any idea what was going on, and half the group had given up and started watching TV in the other room. The host kept insisting it was a huge success because everyone had fun in their own way. Story 56. I once agreed to go on a weekend road trip with some friends, thinking it would be a fun getaway. What they didn't mention was that the trip was meticulously planned down to the minute. The itinerary included a schedule for bathroom breaks, specific times to stop for gas, and even mandatory photo ops at designated landmarks. Things started falling apart when we hit traffic and missed a key photo moment. One of my friends completely lost it, saying, "This ruins the whole trip." From then on, every delay was treated like a personal attack. When we finally reached our destination, everyone was too stressed to enjoy it. By the time we got back home, no one was speaking to each other. I haven't gone on another trip with them since, and now I always ask if relaxation is part of the plan before agreeing to anything. Story 57. My roommate once decided to try their hand at interior design by upcycling old furniture they found on the street. They dragged in a broken chair, a cracked coffee table, and what looked like part of a dresser. The plan was to transform it into something amazing. They spent days sanding, painting, and gluing, only to end up with a wobbly chair, a table covered in uneven paint, and a dresser that was somehow missing more pieces than when they started. They proudly showed off their creations, saying, "It has a rustic charm." I tried to be supportive, but it was hard to ignore how the chair creaked ominously every time someone sat on it. Eventually, they abandoned the project, leaving the upcycled furniture in our living room for months. Guests would come over and ask, "Is this intentional?" And I'd have to awkwardly explain. Story 58. A coworker once brought a homemade lunch to work every day and insisted it was the healthiest thing ever. The problem? It was the same meal every single day. Boiled chicken, plain rice, and steamed broccoli. They'd microwave it in the break room, and the smell would linger for hours. One day, someone jokingly asked if they ever ate anything else, and they launched into a 10-minute speech about how variety is overrated, and their meal plan was the key to success. We later found out they weren't even making it themselves. They were paying a meal prep service to deliver the same bland food every week. Eventually, they switched jobs, but their legacy lived on in the office. For months, whenever someone microwaved broccoli, someone else would say, "Smells like success." Story 59. A friend once invited me to their cousin's wedding, claiming it would be the party of the year. When we got there, the ceremony was delayed by an hour because the groom forgot his suit. When he finally arrived, it turned out he'd borrowed a tux that was 2 sizes too big, so he spent the entire ceremony holding up his pants. The reception wasn't much better. The DJ forgot half the playlist, and the cake collapsed before anyone could cut it. The bride, clearly fed up, ended the night by saying, "Well, at least it's over." On the drive home, my friend turned to me and said, That was incredible, right? I just nodded, wondering what their definition of a party was. Story 60. My neighbor once decided to throw a neighborhood barbecue, but didn't own a grill. Their solution? They built one out of cinder blocks, a metal grate, and a hairdryer for extra heat. Surprisingly, it worked, until the hairdryer overheated and stopped working mid-cookout. Undeterred, they tried to fan the flames manually with a cardboard box, which resulted in ashes flying everywhere. Half the burgers ended up burnt, and the rest were covered in soot. Everyone politely ate anyway, pretending it wasn't the worst barbecue they'd ever attended. The neighbor declared it a success and said they were thinking of starting a catering business. To this day, no one has let them forget it. Story 61. I once joined a gym with a friend who was super into fitness. They insisted on being my personal trainer, even though they had no qualifications. Their first piece of advice was to try lifting more weight than I'd ever attempted. I hesitated, but they said, "You'll never know your limits if you don't push them." 2 minutes in, I dropped the barbell and almost crushed my foot. Instead of apologizing, they said, "That's just part of the process." They then proceeded to coach me on cardio, making me run so fast on the treadmill that I tripped and flew off the back. By the end of the session, I was sore, bruised, and ready to cancel my membership. My friend? They proudly said, "You're doing great. Just imagine how strong you'll be in 6 months." I didn't last 6 days. Story 62. My cousin decided to host a backyard movie night and invited the whole family. They rented a projector, set up chairs, and even made a concession stand with popcorn and candy. It sounded perfect until the mosquitoes arrived. Half an hour in, everyone was swatting at bugs instead of watching the movie. My cousin, determined to save the night, brought out citronella candles, which promptly blew out in the wind. Then they tried spraying everyone with bug spray, but it just made the popcorn taste weird. By the end of the night, most of the family had retreated inside, leaving my cousin alone in the backyard, stubbornly watching the movie. The next day, they posted on social media, "Last night was a total success." Marshalan 63. A friend once told me they were amazing at baking and invited me over to try their famous cheesecake. When I arrived, they were frantically trying to scrape burnt crust off the bottom of the pan. Apparently, they'd forgotten to set a timer and only remembered the cheesecake when the kitchen started smelling like smoke. They handed me a slice, proudly saying, "Don't worry, it's just a little crispy." I took one bite and immediately regretted it. The filling tasted like raw eggs, and the crust was practically charcoal. They laughed and said, "Guess I was a little rusty." The funniest part? They still insisted it was the best cheesecake ever. I politely declined seconds and haven't eaten cheesecake since. Story 64. I once attended a work potluck where one coworker brought a family recipe casserole. It looked fine, but when I took a bite, it tasted odd. A few other people whispered that it didn't seem fully cooked. The coworker overheard and said, "Oh, it's fine. That's just how we like it. Extra gooey." An hour later, half the office started feeling sick. When we asked what was in the casserole, the coworker casually mentioned they'd forgotten to cook the meat beforehand, thinking it would bake in the oven. The rest of the potluck was spent trying to find antacids and deciding who would break the news to HR. They never brought food to a potluck again, which everyone agreed was probably for the best. Story 65. A neighbor once decided to throw a block party and sent out flyers promising live music, games, and delicious homemade food. When the day arrived, the live music was their teenage cousin awkwardly playing guitar, the games were a single pack of Uno cards, and the homemade food was a stack of peanut butter sandwiches. Most people left within an hour, but the neighbor seemed thrilled. They went around asking if everyone was having fun and telling stories about how much effort they'd put into planning. No one had the heart to tell them it was the least eventful party anyone had ever attended. The next year, they sent out the same flyer, and suddenly everyone was busy that day. Story 66. I once had a coworker who was obsessed with saving money. Their latest brilliant idea was to stop buying coffee and start making it in the office kitchen. Sounds reasonable, right? Except their version of making coffee involved reusing the same grounds all week. By Friday, it was more like dirty water than actual coffee. When someone finally asked why it tasted so bad, they proudly explained their method, claiming it was economical and eco-friendly. HR eventually had to step in after multiple complaints, but instead of stopping, they just started brewing their coffee at home and bringing it in. Cold and somehow even worse. Everyone else chipped in to buy a better coffee machine just to avoid drinking whatever they brought. Story 67. My friend once decided they wanted to experience van life and borrowed an old van from their uncle. They had no plan, no supplies, and absolutely no idea what they were doing. Their first night camping, they parked in a spot that turned into a mud pit after it rained. They spent hours trying to push the van out, eventually calling for a tow truck. The next day, they realized they'd forgotten to pack food and had to drive an hour to the nearest town to buy snacks. By the end of the weekend, they were so fed up they abandoned the whole idea and went home. Now they just talk about that one time they lived in a van like it was some grand adventure. Story 68. A neighbor once decided to start a vegetable garden, but didn't bother reading anything about how to do it. They just threw a bunch of seeds in the dirt and hoped for the best. When nothing grew after a few weeks, they dumped an entire bag of fertilizer on it, thinking that would help. It didn't. The fertilizer burned the soil, and whatever sprouts had survived were completely ruined. Undeterred, they tried again the next year, but forgot to water the plants regularly. When I asked how it was going, they said, "It's just nature's way of weeding out the weak ones." Eventually, they gave up and covered the garden with fake plastic plants. From a distance, it actually looked pretty good. Story 69. I once went to a birthday dinner for a friend at a trendy new restaurant they had been raving about for weeks. When we got there, the menu had 3 items on it, none of which anyone actually wanted to eat. The portions were so small we ended up ordering one of everything just to share, but it still wasn't enough. The friend kept saying, "Isn't this place amazing?" while we all secretly debated stopping for burgers on the way home. To make matters worse, the bill was outrageously expensive, and the service was so slow we were there for almost 4 hours. Afterward, the friend asked if we should go back for their next birthday. Everyone suddenly remembered they had plans for that night. Story 70. My cousin once decided to run a marathon with 0 training. They figured, how hard can it be? It's just running. On race day, they started off strong, sprinting ahead of everyone, but by mile 3, they were completely out of breath. They ended up walking most of the course, stopping at every water station to rest. By mile 10, they were sitting on the curb, eating an energy bar and chatting with spectators like they were at a picnic. They didn't even finish. They called a cab at mile 15 and proudly told everyone they'd almost made it. To this day, they still wear the race shirt and tell people they're a marathoner. To 71. I once had a roommate who thought they could save money by fixing everything in the apartment themselves. One day, the kitchen faucet started leaking. Instead of calling the landlord, they watched a few videos online and declared themselves a plumbing expert. Within an hour, the entire sink was detached and water was spraying everywhere. They tried to fix their mistake by shutting off the main water valve, which somehow flooded the bathroom too. When I suggested we call a professional, they said, "No way, I've got this." Spoiler, they didn't. By the time the plumber arrived the next day, the repairs were twice as expensive as they would have been originally. My roommate's response? "At least I tried. I still haven't figured out if they were more clueless or just stubborn." Story 72. A friend of mine decided to throw a fancy dinner party, despite the fact they couldn't cook. They spent the entire day trying to make a complicated recipe they'd never attempted before. Something involving soufflés and homemade sauce. By the time the guests arrived, the soufflés were burned and the sauce had congealed into an unrecognizable blob. Instead of admitting defeat, they tried to pass it off as experimental cuisine. No one could even pretend to enjoy it. After a few polite bites, someone suggested ordering pizza. My friend sulked the rest of the night saying, "I was trying to be unique." Their idea of a fancy dinner party now? Takeout and paper plates. Story 73. I once went to a work retreat that promised team bonding activities and relaxation. Instead, it turned into a weekend of overly competitive games that left everyone more stressed than before. The highlight, or lowlight, was a trust fall exercise where the person catching me stepped away at the last second, saying, "Sorry, I got distracted." Later, there was a trivia competition where two managers got into an actual shouting match over whether Pluto should still be considered a planet. The retreat ended with an awkward dinner where everyone was too tired and annoyed to make conversation. On Monday, HR sent out a survey asking if we'd like to do another retreat next year. Every response was a hard no. Story 74. My neighbor once decided to take up woodworking. At first, they kept it simple: birdhouses and small shelves. But then they got ambitious and tried to build a full dining table from scratch. Every day, I'd hear sawing and hammering, often late into the night. When I asked how it was going, they said, "It's a masterpiece in progress." After a few weeks, they proudly invited me over to see it. The table wobbled so much that just putting a glass on it felt like a risk. They insisted it was rustic charm, but it was clearly a disaster waiting to happen. The table didn't last a month before collapsing under the weight of their Thanksgiving turkey. They're back to birdhouses now. Story 75. A co-worker once brought their toddler to the office, claiming they didn't have childcare that day. Everyone was fine with it at first, until the toddler got into the supply closet and started unrolling every roll of paper they could find. Then they found the office printer and somehow managed to print 50 copies of a picture of a cartoon dinosaur. The parent tried to calm things down by giving the toddler their phone, but that just led to loud YouTube videos playing on repeat. By lunchtime, half the office was ready to quit. The parent finally left early, saying, "Thanks for understanding." The next day, we found glitter glue in the copier. I still don't know how they managed that. Story 76. I once went to a Halloween party where the host insisted everyone dress as something unexpected and creative. Most people showed up as pun-based costumes like serial killer or French toast. But one guy took it way too far and came dressed as a washing machine. He had a full cardboard box rigged up with soap bubbles coming out of the top. It was funny at first, but then he realized he couldn't sit down or move through the crowded house without knocking into people. By the end of the night, he had to take the costume off completely and just stood there, holding a sign that said, "Out of order." The host, meanwhile, was upset because the washing machine guy stole the spotlight from their costume, a very niche character no one recognized. I left early, but I still think about that washing machine every Halloween. Story 77. My cousin decided to start vlogging their journey to minimalism. The first video showed them dramatically throwing out half their wardrobe and talking about how stuff weighs us down. The problem? They didn't actually get rid of anything. They just moved it all into their garage. A week later, they were back to shopping online, claiming they were buying essential items. By the third video, they were showing off new gadgets and saying, "Minimalism is about keeping only what sparks joy." Their audience started calling them out in the comments, and the vlogging series quietly disappeared. Their garage is still full of stuff they let go of. Story 78. I once had a co-worker who was convinced they were a tech genius. One day, they announced they were going to fix the office Wi-Fi, even though IT had already warned us not to touch it. Within an hour, they'd somehow disconnected the entire network. When IT arrived to figure out what happened, the co-worker proudly said, "Don't worry, I saved us money by troubleshooting myself." It wasn't amused. It took them the rest of the day to undo the damage, and the co-worker spent the week complaining that it just doesn't appreciate initiative. They still bring it up occasionally, claiming their fix was just misunderstood. Story 79. A friend once asked me to help them move into their new apartment. When I arrived, I realized they hadn't packed a single thing. Clothes were still in drawers, dishes were in the sink, and books were scattered everywhere. They said, "I thought we could just throw everything into boxes together." It turned into an all-day project, with random items being shoved into whatever box was closest. By the time we finished, nothing was labeled, and half their stuff was still at the old place. They promised to organize it later, but weeks passed, and every time I visited, they were still digging through boxes looking for things. When they moved again a year later, I suddenly had other plans. Story 80. My neighbor once decided to host a potluck, but instead of asking people to bring specific dishes, they just said, "Bring whatever you want." Predictably, this resulted in 5 desserts, 3 salads, and no main course. The neighbor's contribution? A single bag of chips and a jar of salsa. Someone finally ran to the store to grab a rotisserie chicken. But by then, most people had already filled up on brownies and cookies. The neighbor kept saying, "Isn't this fun? It's so spontaneous." The next day, they texted everyone asking for feedback so they could make it even better next time. No one responded. Story 81. I once went to a surprise birthday party where the birthday person didn't even show up. The host had told us to arrive early so we could all hide and yell, "Surprise!" when they walked in. We waited for nearly 2 hours before someone called the guest of honor, who casually said, "Oh, I made other plans." The host was devastated, but instead of canceling, they tried to salvage the evening by turning it into a regular party. Half the guests left immediately, and the rest stayed out of pity. We ended up eating the cake awkwardly, with "Happy Birthday" written on it for someone who wasn't even there. The host tried to laugh it off, but you could tell they were crushed. We all agreed never to plan a surprise party again. Story 82. My coworker once decided to host a trivia night for the office. It sounded fun at first, but they made the questions ridiculously specific. Things like, what was the name of the third assistant director on Titanic? No one knew any of the answers, but they kept insisting. It's not that hard if you think about it. When people started losing interest, they got frustrated and began throwing out random hints that made no sense. By the end, only 2 people were still playing, and even they admitted they were just guessing. The next day, the coworker sent an email saying, "Next time, I'll make it easier." There was no next time. Story 83. A friend of mine once decided they were going to train for a marathon. They bought all the gear, running shoes, a fancy watch, and even energy gels, but never actually trained. On race day, they barely made it past the starting line before pulling a muscle. Instead of going home, they walked the entire course, stopping for snacks at every water station. They finished hours after everyone else, but they still wore the medal proudly, saying, "It's all about the journey, not the time." They posted the whole thing on social media as if they'd won first place. To this day, they still call themselves a marathoner. Story 84. My neighbor once tried to set up a home theater in their backyard. They bought a projector, a giant screen, and even a popcorn machine. It looked amazing, until the wind picked up. The screen toppled over within minutes, knocking over the projector and spilling popcorn everywhere. Determined not to give up, they duct-taped the screen to 2 trees and tried again. This time the projector overheated, and the movie froze halfway through. People started leaving, but the neighbor kept saying, "Just give me 5 more minutes!" By the end of the night, it was just them and a couple of diehards sitting in the dark, watching the screen flapping in the wind. The next morning, they posted online, "Huge success! Can't wait for the next one." Story 85. I once worked with someone who insisted on doing everything the old-fashioned way. They refused to use email, opting for handwritten notes instead, which meant everything took twice as long. They'd also print out every document, mark it up with a pen, and then scan it back into the system. One time, they spent hours writing out a report by hand, only to spill coffee all over it before submitting it. When asked why they didn't just type it, they said, "This is how things were done in the golden days." Management eventually made them switch to digital, but they still printed out every email, just in case. I'm still not sure how they got anything done. Story 86. I once attended a friend's DIY wedding, which sounded charming, until I got there. The ceremony was in their backyard, which was fine, but they had no seating, so everyone had to stand for over an hour. The catering was a potluck, and the cake was a store-bought sheet cake with congrats spelled wrong in frosting. During the vows, the groom forgot what he was supposed to say and tried to improvise, which ended with him declaring, "I promise to, do my best." Later, the bride's uncle accidentally knocked over the sound system, so the music was just people humming along to someone's phone. The couple seemed happy, but by the end of the night, most of the guests were just hungry and tired. I still think about that misspelled cake every time I go to a wedding. Story 87. A coworker once decided to do a team-building scavenger hunt during lunch. They made a list of random items we had to find around the office, like a red paperclip, a coffee mug with a logo, and a pen with blue ink. It sounded fun at first, but they made the rules so strict that no one could find anything. For example, the blue ink pen couldn't have any black writing on the outside, and the coffee mug had to be from a specific company. People started giving up halfway through, but the coworker kept pushing, saying, "We just need to try harder." By the time the hunt ended, no one was speaking to each other, and lunch was long over. The coworker called it a success because they found everything on the list themselves. Story 88. A neighbor once decided to train their parrot to talk. They spent hours every day repeating phrases like, "Who's a pretty bird?" and "Good morning." The problem was the parrot started picking up everything they said, including all their arguments with their spouse. Soon, the parrot was squawking phrases like, "I told you to take out the trash," and "Why can't you listen?" It got so loud that other neighbors started complaining. The funniest part? The parrot learned to mimic the sound of the doorbell, which caused endless confusion. Eventually, they had to move the parrot to the garage during the day. Last I heard, it's still shouting, "I need space!" at anyone who walks by. To 89. A friend of mine once decided to host a board game night, but didn't bother reading the rules of any of the games beforehand. We spent the first hour trying to figure out how to set up a game they insisted was super easy. When we finally started playing, they made up rules on the spot, which led to endless arguments. At one point, someone pulled out the actual rule book, and it turned out we'd been playing completely wrong. The host laughed and said, "Rules are just guidelines anyway." We eventually switched to a simpler game, but by then, most people were too annoyed to care. The host still insists it was the best game night ever. Story 90. My cousin decided to renovate their kitchen themselves to save money. They watched a few tutorials online and started ripping out cabinets and countertops without a clear plan. Halfway through, they realized they had no idea how to install the new cabinets and called me for help. When I arrived, the kitchen was a mess, with tools scattered everywhere and appliances pushed into the hallway. They proudly showed me their progress, which included uneven cabinet doors and a sink that wasn't connected to any plumbing. I suggested hiring a professional, but they insisted, "I've got this." A week later, they called again to say the entire kitchen floor was flooded. They finally gave in and hired someone, but the repair bill ended up being double what it would have cost to hire a pro in the first place. For 91. I once attended a community talent show where my neighbor decided to perform stand-up comedy. The problem? They weren't funny. Their entire routine was just awkward observations about the audience like, "Why does Steve always wear that red hat? And what's the deal with Karen's laugh?" Halfway through, someone shouted, "Tell a joke!" which only made things worse. They panicked and started Googling jokes on their phone, reading them out loud without even trying to deliver a punchline. By the time they finished, the audience was clapping, not because they were entertained, but because it was finally over. The next day, they proudly told everyone it was a huge success because they got the most claps. Story 92. My friend once decided they were going to become a chef influencer on social media. They started filming themselves cooking elaborate dishes, but the kitchen was always a mess, and half the time they forgot to hit record. One video showed them flambeing a dessert, only for the flame to get out of control and scorch their curtains. Instead of editing it out, they posted the video with the caption, "When life gives you lemons, make fire." Surprisingly, it went semi-viral, but for all the wrong reasons. People started commenting things like, "Is this a comedy channel? And do you have insurance?" They eventually gave up on cooking videos and switched to unboxing gadgets. The kitchen hasn't been the same since. Story 93. A coworker once volunteered to organize a team picnic, saying they wanted to boost morale. They picked the park with no shade on a day when the temperature was over 90 degrees. By the time everyone arrived, we were already sweating buckets. They forgot to bring drinks, so someone had to run to the store for water. The food consisted of a few bags of chips and a store-bought veggie platter, which quickly wilted in the heat. As if that wasn't bad enough, a swarm of bees decided to crash the party. The coworker kept insisting we play games like sack races and tug-of-war, but everyone was too hot and miserable to move. The only thing we bonded over was how much we wanted to leave. Story 94. My cousin once decided to try their hand at woodworking and promised to make me a custom coffee table as a gift. I thought it was a sweet gesture until I saw the table. It was uneven, with one leg noticeably shorter than the others, and the stain they used made it sticky to the touch. They insisted it was rustic, but the table wobbled so much that I couldn't even set a cup on it without spilling. When I gently pointed out the issues, they said, "That's part of the charm." I ended up using it as a plant stand because it was the only thing light enough not to tip it over. They still ask me how I'm enjoying the masterpiece. Story 95. A friend once decided they wanted to learn guitar in a weekend and borrowed one from another friend. They spent 2 days watching tutorials online and proudly invited us over for their first concert. What followed was a painfully out-of-tune rendition of "Smoke on the Water," played at half speed with random notes thrown in. We clapped politely, but they mistook it as genuine enthusiasm and decided to play another song. This time, something they'd written themselves. It was just 3 chords repeated over and over, with lyrics about their cat. The next day, they returned the guitar, saying, "I think I've mastered it." I still shudder every time I hear that song. Story 96. A neighbor once decided they wanted to host a mystery dinner party with a detective theme. They hyped it up for weeks, talking about costumes, clues, and a shocking twist. When the night came, the mystery was that someone had stolen the dessert, a pie they never actually made. The clues were random objects they found around the house, like a pair of socks and an old key, and none of them made sense. Halfway through, people started eating the snacks and ignoring the game. By the end of the night, the neighbor was upset that no one had solved the case, and we were all just happy to go home. The next morning, they posted on social media about how successful the party was. We all just nodded and let them have it. Story 97. I once worked with someone who insisted they were an expert in astrology. They'd spend their lunch breaks analyzing everyone's birth charts and giving unsolicited readings. One day, they told a coworker they were definitely going to get promoted soon because of their stellar Mars alignment. A week later, that coworker was laid off. The self-proclaimed astrologer tried to backtrack, saying, "Oh, I must have misread the chart. It was actually a new beginning for you." They stopped giving predictions after that, but they still tried to guess people's zodiac signs based on their coffee orders. It didn't go well. Story 98. My cousin once decided they were going to make their own wine. They bought a kit online, set it up in their garage, and told everyone to expect the best homemade vintage. The first batch tasted like vinegar, but they insisted it needed more time to age. By the third batch, the bottles were exploding because they didn't seal them properly. They ended up with a sticky mess all over their garage and gave up on the whole project. To this day, they still insist they were so close to perfecting it. Whenever we visit, we bring them a bottle of store-bought wine, just in case they get inspired again. Story 99. A friend once dragged me to a karaoke night, claiming it was just for fun. When we got there, they signed us up for a duet without telling me. I can't sing to save my life, but they insisted we'd bring the house down with a dramatic rendition of Bohemian Rhapsody. What followed was 3 minutes of us butchering every note while the audience awkwardly clapped along. My friend was completely off key, but sang with so much enthusiasm that no one could look away. Afterward, they said, "We crushed it." I avoided karaoke for years after that. My friend, they started going every week. Story 100. My coworker once decided to optimize the office layout to make it more efficient. Without consulting anyone, they rearranged desks, swapped chairs, and even moved the printer to the farthest corner of the office. Their reasoning? It'll encourage people to stretch their legs. The new setup was a disaster. People couldn't find their files. The printer jammed constantly because it was in a drafty spot, and someone even tripped over a misplaced power cable. After 2 days of chaos, the manager had everything put back the way it was. The coworker, undeterred, said, "Well, at least I tried." They still talk about how innovative their idea was. Story 101. I once attended a charity bake sale where a coworker proudly displayed their famous cupcakes. They looked great, brightly frosted and decorated with sprinkles, but the first bite was a shock. They'd forgotten to add sugar to the batter, and the frosting tasted like straight butter. When people started quietly setting the cupcakes aside, the coworker loudly asked, "Aren't they amazing?" No one had the heart to tell them the truth, so they kept handing out more. By the end of the day, there were still dozens left, and they blamed it on low turnout. They later announced they were considering opening a bakery. We all just nodded and smiled. Story 102. A neighbor once decided to take up jogging and announced they were going to run every morning at sunrise. For the first week, they stuck to it, loudly slamming the door at 5 a.m. every day. But by the second week, they started adjusting their schedule, jogging at 10 a.m., then noon, and eventually not at all. When someone asked how their running was going, they said, "Oh, I'm focusing on recovery right now." A month later, their jogging shoes were listed in a yard sale with the tag, "Barely used." Story 103. A friend once decided to host a paint night at their house. They told everyone to bring their own canvas and promised they'd provide the paints. When we arrived, we found out their paints were actually leftover craft supplies, markers, crayons, and half-dried watercolor palettes. We tried to make it work, but it quickly turned into a mess. Someone spilled water all over their canvas, another person broke a crayon trying to shade, and by the end of the night, most of us had resorted to doodling on scrap paper. The friend proudly displayed their masterpiece on the fridge and said, "We should do this every month." We all quietly hoped they'd forget. Story 104. I once worked with someone who insisted on starting every meeting with an icebreaker. At first, it was harmless. Questions like, "What's your favorite movie?" But then they started getting more elaborate, asking things like, "If you were a fruit, what would you be and why?" One day, they brought a box of props to the meeting and told us we had to act out our answers. Someone had to mime being a pineapple, and another pretended to be a banana, slipping on its own peel. It was the most awkward meeting I've ever attended. After that, people started showing up late just to skip the icebreakers. The organizer eventually stopped, but still insists it was a great bonding experience. Story 105. My cousin once decided they were going to write a novel in a single weekend. They stocked up on snacks, locked themselves in their room and said, "Don't bother me unless it's an emergency." By Sunday night, they emerged, looking exhausted but triumphant, and declared the novel finished. When I asked to read it, they hesitated and said it wasn't ready for feedback yet. Months later, I found out the novel was only 10 pages long, mostly filled with random plot ideas and a character named Hero Guy. They're still telling people they're working on the edits to this day. Story 106. A coworker once decided to bring in their slow cooker to share a family recipe with the office. They set it up in the break room and told everyone to wait for the magic. By lunchtime, the smell of burnt onions filled the air, and the slow cooker was emitting a strange sizzling noise. When someone checked, they discovered the coworker had forgotten to add any liquid, leaving the ingredients to char at the bottom. Instead of throwing it out, they insisted it was still salvageable and tried serving it anyway. Most people politely declined, but one brave soul took a bite and immediately ran for water. The coworker's response? Maybe it just needs more salt. Story 107. A neighbor once decided they were going to build their own pizza oven in their backyard. They bought bricks, cement, and a giant metal dome, proudly declaring it would be restaurant quality. The problem? They had no idea how to mix cement, and the entire structure collapsed the first time they lit a fire. Undeterred, they tried again, using glue to hold the bricks together. This time, the oven stayed upright, but the glue melted during cooking, ruining the pizza and leaving a toxic smell. They finally gave up and bought a countertop pizza maker, saying, "I just wanted to keep things simple." Story 108. I once went to a friend's DIY spa night, where they promised homemade face masks and relaxation. When I arrived, they handed me a bowl of green sludge and said, "It's all natural." I asked what was in it, and they shrugged, saying, "Mostly avocado and something I found in the pantry." I reluctantly put it on my face, only to realize too late that it was burning. It turned out they'd accidentally used chili powder instead of cinnamon. Everyone spent the rest of the night rinsing their faces and trying not to laugh. The friend still insists it was a learning experience. Torbata 9. My cousin decided they wanted to build a treehouse for their kids, but refused to use a blueprint. They said, "It'll be more fun to just wing it." The result was a lopsided structure with a ladder that barely held up under its own weight. When I asked if it was safe, they said, "Kids need to take risks to learn." The first time their kids climbed it, the whole thing tilted dangerously, and they had to jump off to avoid falling. My cousin eventually took it down, but still tells everyone about the great treehouse they built. Story 110. A friend once tried to grow their own herbs, claiming it would save money and be super easy. They bought a fancy indoor planter and a variety of seeds, but forgot to read the instructions. They overwatered everything, and within a week, the herbs were moldy and dying. Instead of starting over, they declared the plants just needed more light and set up a desk lamp. When that didn't work, they said, "I think the seeds were defective." The planter eventually ended up in a closet, and they went back to buying dried herbs from the store. Story 111. My neighbor once announced they were starting a zero-waste lifestyle and immediately tried to compost everything. They set up a compost bin in their backyard but didn't bother looking up how to use it properly. They threw in all their food scraps, including meat, dairy, and greasy takeout containers. Within days, the bin reeked, and flies swarmed their yard. Instead of fixing the issue, they sprayed air freshener directly into the bin, claiming it would balance things out. The smell only got worse, and eventually, a raccoon knocked the whole thing over, spreading the mess everywhere. They gave up after that, but still tell people they tried their best to save the planet. Story 112. A co-worker once decided to plan the office holiday party themselves, saying they wanted it to be extra special. They rented a banquet hall but forgot to arrange for catering, so the only food was a bag of chips and a tray of cookies they brought from home. For entertainment, they set up a karaoke machine, but didn't test it beforehand, so it only played one song, Jingle Bells, on repeat. By the end of the night, everyone was either starving or desperately trying to avoid the mic. When people politely suggested hiring a planner next time, they said, "But this was so much fun!" We all smiled and nodded, silently agreeing never to bring it up again. 113. A friend of mine decided they wanted to start making candles as a hobby. They bought a kit online and invited me over to help with their first batch. Everything seemed fine until they added way too much essential oil, turning the wax into a bubbling mess. When they poured the mixture into molds, the scent was so overpowering that we had to open all the windows. After the candles cooled, they were lumpy and uneven, and lighting one immediately filled the room with an eye-watering cloud of lavender and peppermint. They still gifted me one for my birthday, calling it custom-made. I keep it on a shelf, but I've never dared to light it. Story 114. My cousin once decided to surprise their partner with a homemade anniversary dinner. They picked a complicated recipe they'd never tried before, beef Wellington. By the time I arrived to help, the kitchen was a disaster. The beef was raw, the pastry was burned, and the sauce was lumpy. I suggested switching to something simpler, but they were determined. When their partner got home, they tried to salvage the meal by calling it deconstructed beef Wellington. The partner laughed and said, "You could have just ordered pizza." The next year, they wisely went with takeout and candles. Story 115. A friend once insisted we all join them on a group hike, saying it would be an easy trail for beginners. Turns out they misread the map, and the easy trail was actually a 10-mile loop with steep inclines. Half the group was out of breath within the first mile. By the third mile, someone twisted their ankle, and we realized no one had brought enough water. The friend kept saying, "It's just around the corner." But we didn't finish the hike until well after sunset. They still insist it was a great bonding experience, though no one has gone hiking with them since. For 116. My coworker once decided to make the office more fun by organizing a surprise talent show during lunch. They didn't tell anyone beforehand and just started walking around, asking people to perform something. Most of us awkwardly declined, but a few brave souls volunteered. One person attempted to juggle staplers and nearly hit someone in the face. Another tried to sing but forgot the lyrics halfway through. The grand finale was the organizer themselves, who performed a painfully long interpretive dance about work-life balance. Afterward, they asked for feedback, and everyone politely said it was interesting. The next week, they sent out a survey asking if we'd like to make the talent show a monthly event. No one responded. Story 117. A friend once decided to start a garden despite having no experience. They planted tomatoes, cucumbers, and carrots, all in the same tiny patch of soil, with no regard for spacing or sunlight. Within a month, the tomatoes had taken over, the cucumbers were strangling the carrots, and everything looked like a jungle. They tried to fix it by trimming random leaves and spraying everything with fertilizer. Instead of helping, it just made the plants wilt faster. When harvest time came, they ended up with one tiny, misshapen tomato and a cucumber that looked like it had been through a war. They proudly declared the garden a success and said they were excited to try again next year. The rest of us quietly agreed to bring vegetables from the store instead. Story 118. My cousin once tried to host a movie marathon at their house, but didn't think to check how long the movies were. They picked the extended editions of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, promising it would be an epic experience. What they didn't mention was that they expected everyone to stay for the full 12-hour runtime. By the second movie, half the group had fallen asleep, and the snacks were completely gone. When someone suggested taking a break, my cousin said, "Real fans watch it all the way through." By the time we finished, it was 3 a.m., and no one had the energy to talk about the movies. The next day, my cousin called it one of the best nights ever. The rest of us quietly swore never to agree to a marathon again. Story 119. A neighbor once decided to organize a block-wide garage sale, claiming it would bring everyone together. They made flyers and told everyone to set up their tables on Saturday morning. But when the day arrived, they were the only one who actually participated. Instead of calling it off, they decided to turn their driveway into a carnival, complete with balloons and a boombox playing upbeat music. They spent the entire day trying to sell old clothes and knickknacks to the few confused people who wandered by. By the end of the day, they'd sold a single coffee mug and a pair of mismatched socks. They still declared it a huge success and promised to do it again next year. No one else has mentioned it since. Story 120. A friend once decided to start a podcast, saying it would be the next big thing. They had no equipment, no plan, and no idea what the podcast would be about. Their solution? We'll just talk about random stuff and see what happens. The first episode was over 2 hours long, mostly consisting of them rambling about their day and laughing at their own jokes. They uploaded it anyway, proudly announcing they were officially podcasters. When no one listened, they blamed it on a bad release date and promised the next episode would be better. The second episode never came, but they still tell people they had a podcast. Story 121. A friend of mine once decided to train their cat to do tricks, claiming they'd seen it work on YouTube. They started with simple things like sit and high five. The cat, however, had zero interest. Instead of following commands, it would just stare at them or walk away. Frustrated, they bought a clicker and treats, hoping to motivate the cat. It worked, sort of. The cat learned to swat at the clicker to knock it out of their hand, which they interpreted as progress. After weeks of trying, the only trick the cat had mastered was jumping on the counter to steal treats when their back was turned. They eventually gave up, claiming, "My cat's just too smart for tricks." The cat? Still stealing treats and ignoring commands. Story 122. My neighbor once announced they were going to get into cycling and bought a top-of-the-line road bike, complete with matching gear. They talked endlessly about their plans to ride every weekend and even signed up for a 50-mile charity event. On their first ride, they made it less than a mile before realizing they didn't know how to use the gears properly. They ended up walking the bike home, muttering about technical issues. Instead of practicing, they spent the next month buying accessories they didn't need, like a GPS tracker and custom water bottles. By the time the charity ride came around, they dropped out saying, "It's more about the lifestyle than the actual riding." The bike is now gathering dust in their garage. Story 123. I once went to a friend's pajama brunch, where everyone was supposed to wear their coziest pajamas. It sounded fun until one guest showed up in a full onesie with a dinosaur tail and proceeded to act like a dinosaur the entire time. They roared during conversations, pretended to hunt the pastries, and even tried to knock over a stack of pancakes with their tail. Most people laughed awkwardly, but by the end of the brunch, it was clear the act had worn thin. When someone asked if they could be normal for 5 minutes, they said, "This is normal. It's a pajama brunch." The host later admitted they regretted inviting the dinosaur, and the brunch idea quietly disappeared from their social calendar. Top 124. My cousin once decided they were going to learn to code and bought a bunch of online courses. For the first week, they were glued to their computer, proudly showing off basic HTML pages with random colors and text. Then they tried to make a website and immediately hit a wall. Instead of asking for help or doing more research, they decided coding was too easy and moved on to something more challenging. A month later, they claimed they were going to invent an app without writing a single line of code. They still tell people they know how to code, even though their only completed project is a web page that says "Hello World" in neon pink. Story 125. A coworker once decided to get creative with their cubicle decorations and brought in string lights, fake plants, and even a small fountain. At first it looked nice, but then the fountain started leaking onto their desk. They fixed it by putting it in a Tupperware container, which just made it look sad. The string lights, meanwhile, overloaded the outlet and tripped the circuit breaker, leaving half the office in the dark. They insisted it was worth it for the ambience, but had to remove everything after the facilities manager intervened. Now their cubicle has nothing but a single motivational poster that says, "Dream big." They still say they're thinking about a redesign. Story 126. My neighbor once decided they wanted to host a neighborhood chili cook-off. They hyped it up for weeks, claiming they had a secret family recipe that would win for sure. When the day arrived, they showed up with a giant pot of chili that looked promising, until people started tasting it. It turns out their secret ingredient was cinnamon, and they had added way too much. The chili tasted more like dessert than a savory dish, but they didn't seem to notice. They kept going around, asking, "Isn't it amazing?" while people politely nodded and quickly set their bowls aside. They didn't win, of course, but they insisted the judges just didn't understand complex flavors. The rest of us quietly agreed to skip the cook-off next year. Story 127. A friend of mine decided to start knitting during the pandemic, saying it would be relaxing. They started with a scarf, but quickly got frustrated when it came out uneven. Instead of practicing, they decided to jump straight into making a sweater, using a pattern they found online. Halfway through, they realized they'd miscounted the stitches, so one sleeve was twice as long as the other. Rather than fixing it, they declared it a custom design and finished the sweater anyway. When they tried it on, it looked like a lopsided blanket. They still wear it sometimes, claiming it's artsy. No one has the heart to tell them it's unwearable. Story 128. A coworker once decided they were going to create a team mascot to boost morale. They bought a giant stuffed animal, a penguin, and started bringing it to meetings, saying it was there to observe and inspire. They even gave it a name, Mr. Waddles. At first, it was mildly amusing, but then they started making everyone take turns, holding Mr. Waddles during meetings. It quickly became awkward, especially when someone accidentally spilled coffee on it. Instead of retiring the mascot, they just added a bandana to cover the stain and said, "It gives him character." Mr. Waddles eventually disappeared, but the coworker still talks about how he brought us together. Story 129. My cousin once decided they were going to live off the grid for a weekend and dragged me along for the experience. They borrowed camping gear from a friend, but didn't bother learning how to use it. When we arrived at the campsite, they realized they didn't know how to set up the tent and just draped it over a tree branch. For food, they brought a bag of uncooked rice and some canned beans, but forgot a can opener or a pot to cook in. We ended up eating granola bars and drinking lukewarm water the entire weekend. By the second night, they admitted defeat and suggested we head home early to reflect on the experience. Their takeaway? Living off the grid is harder than it looks. Story 130. A neighbor once decided to build their own deck instead of hiring a contractor. They said it would be a fun project and spent weeks watching tutorials online. When they finally started, it became clear they didn't know what they were doing. The boards were uneven, the nails were sticking out, and the whole structure wobbled when you stepped on it. When I pointed out that it didn't look safe, they said, "It's just rustic charm." A few weeks later, the deck partially collapsed during a barbecue, spilling burgers and drinks everywhere. No one was hurt, but the neighbor finally admitted they should have hired a professional. The deck is still there, but no one dares to stand on it. Story 131. My coworker once decided to host a virtual trivia night for the office, claiming it would be the most fun we've had all year. They spent hours putting together questions, but when the event started, it quickly became clear they hadn't tested the format. The trivia platform kept crashing, and half the questions were riddled with typos. One question asked, "What is the capital of Kanasa?" and another had two correct answers, leading to endless arguments in the chat. To make matters worse, they tried to keep it light by adding joke questions about people in the office, which just made things awkward. By the end of the night, most people had logged off, but they still declared it a success, saying, "We'll iron out the kinks for next time." There hasn't been a next time. Story 132. A friend of mine once decided to start brewing their own beer. They bought all the equipment and proudly told everyone to expect craft beer perfection. The first batch turned out flat and tasted like vinegar, but they insisted it was just a practice run. For the second batch, they accidentally used the wrong type of yeast, which resulted in a bottle exploding in their kitchen. Undeterred, they kept experimenting, but every batch seemed to get worse. When they finally gave me a bottle to try, I couldn't get past the first sip. They've since switched to buying beer kits from the store, but still refer to themselves as a home brewer. Story 133. A neighbor once decided they were going to make their own birdhouse. They found a simple design online and started hammering away in their garage. It sounded like a construction site for 3 days straight, and when they finally showed off the finished product, it was unique. The roof was crooked, the entrance hole was too small for any bird, and the whole thing leaned to one side. When I gently pointed out these issues, they said, "It's more about the charm than the functionality." A week later, it fell off the tree they'd nailed it to. They still claim it was a great learning experience. Story 134. My cousin once decided to throw a retro game night and invited everyone over to play old video games. They even rented a classic arcade machine, but they didn't realize it wouldn't fit through their front door. Instead of giving up, they set it up on their porch and hoped it wouldn't rain. When the game started, half the controllers didn't work, and the screen on the arcade machine kept flickering. People eventually gave up and started playing card games instead, which led my cousin to sulk and say, "No one appreciates nostalgia anymore." They've since rebranded game night as casual hangout night, which mostly involves watching Netflix. Story 135. A coworker once decided to start a mindfulness hour during lunch breaks, saying it would help reduce stress in the office. They brought in yoga mats, essential oils, and calming music. The problem? They didn't ask anyone if they wanted to participate. Half the office just wanted to eat their lunch in peace, but they kept insisting everyone join. When people politely declined, they started loudly explaining the benefits of mindfulness while stretching in the middle of the break room. The mindfulness hour lasted about a week before management stepped in and told them to find a private space. They still claim it changed lives, though no one seems to agree. Story 136. My coworker once decided to host a weekly walking meeting to encourage exercise and productivity. They said it would be the perfect blend of work and wellness. The first walk started out fine, but halfway through, they took us down a muddy trail in dress shoes and business attire. By the end, everyone's clothes were splattered with mud, and someone slipped and dropped their notebook in a puddle. The coworker tried to lighten the mood by saying, "Nature keeps us grounded," but no one laughed. The next week, they sent out another invite, and suddenly everyone was too busy to join. The walking meetings quietly disappeared after that.